Have you ever reached the end of a week and realized you cannot quite account for it? Not because anything went wrong, not because you were distracted or overwhelmed, but because the week ran so smoothly, so automatically that you were barely required to be present for it. The days happened, the responses came, the tasks completed themselves through you, and somewhere in the middle of all that functioning, you were not quite there. Do you ever get the sense that large portions of your life are happening on your behalf? That the version of you showing up in most rooms is something more like a recording than a presence? Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would alarm anyone around you. Just in the quiet way where a day ends, and you have the faint feeling that you watched it more than you lived it. Most of what we call living is something closer to repeating. The responses, the roots, the interpretations, running on patterns set so long ago that they no longer feel like patterns at all. They feel like you. This episode is not about breaking habits. It is not about optimization or becoming a better version of yourself. It is about something more unsettling than that. It is about the possibility that most of us have never really looked at the life we are living and what that silence costs. He was, by most measures, a steady person. He kept his commitments. He showed up on time. He did not make scenes. When people described him, the word they used most often was reliable. He had heard it so many times that he had stopped noticing whether it felt like a compliment or a quiet reduction. His mornings followed a sequence. Coffee before conversation, phone before the coffee cooled, the same route to work, the same parking spot when it was available, the same half-attentive nod to the same people in the hallway. None of this was planned. It had simply calcified over years into something that felt like preference. At work, he was efficient. He solved the same categories of problems in the same way he always had, and the solutions were usually fine. His manager trusted him. That trust had been built on consistency, and consistency, he had learned early, was how you earned your footing in any organization. He did not question this. It had always worked. His relationships followed a similar shape. When someone close to him was struggling, he became practical. He asked questions that moved toward solutions. He listened until he thought he understood, and then he gently redirected toward what could be done. This was how he had been raised. His father had been the same way. He did not think of himself as closed off. He thought of himself as grounded. One evening, a person he was close to told him, quietly and without accusation, that they sometimes felt alone around him. Not unloved, just unseen, like he was solving them rather than staying with them. He heard the words. He took them seriously. That night, lying in the dark, he turned the observation over in his mind. He tried to understand where it had come from. He tried to identify what he could adjust. He was still doing it, solving. He did not sleep well, but by morning the discomfort had softened into something manageable. He told himself it had been an emotional night. He made a small mental note. He kept moving. The weeks passed. The pattern did not change. Not because he did not care, not because he was incapable of something different, but because he had never once stopped to ask himself why he moved through the world the way he did. The mechanism had always run quietly in the background. He had never turned to look at it. He kept moving forward, the way you do when the ground beneath you feels solid. The ground had always felt solid. But there were moments, brief, easy to dismiss, when something else surfaced. A conversation that ended slightly too soon, with a feeling he could not name hovering at the edge of it. A Sunday afternoon that felt strangely hollow despite everything being fine. A night when he lay in the dark and could not reconstruct with any real certainty what he actually wanted from the next 5 years. Not what made sense, not what was reasonable, what he actually wanted. He would let those moments pass, not through suppression exactly, more through momentum. The week would resume, the tasks would accumulate. The motion of a functioning life would carry him forward, and the hollow feeling would recede, not resolved but simply outpaced. He had been outpacing it for a long time. Somewhere underneath all of it was a belief he had never said aloud. Not a conscious conviction, more like a foundation stone, buried so deep that the structure above it had been built without anyone remembering it was there. The assumption was something like this: if you are consistent, you are trustworthy. If you are trustworthy, you are safe. If you are safe, you do not need to be examined. This is not an unusual belief. Most of us carry something similar in one form or another. We arrive at it early through experience, through what worked, what earned approval, what prevented pain. And then we carry it forward, not because we chose to, but because nothing ever forced us to put it down. The belief does not announce itself. It operates through behavior, through the reflexive responses that feel like personality, through the resistance to certain kinds of stillness, through the mild irritation you feel when someone asks you to explain yourself, not because the question is unfair, but because you have never needed to answer it before. There is also something else underneath it, a secondary assumption, quieter still. The assumption that self-knowledge is something you either have or you do not, that if you were seriously flawed, you would know, that the absence of obvious problems is itself a kind of evidence. He was not unhappy, not in any way he could clearly name. His life functioned. His relationships held. What would there be to examine? This is how the assumption protects itself. It points to the results and says, "Look, it is working." And because the results are real, because the consistency did earn trust and the reliability did produce safety, the assumption never gets interrogated. He had never been asked to examine his consistency. It had always served him well, so it had remained intact, unchallenged, producing the same results across different decades and different rooms. The assumption is not necessarily wrong. Consistency can be a genuine strength. But a strength that has never been questioned is also a kind of blindness. You begin to mistake the habit for the self. You begin to protect the pattern without knowing you are protecting anything. And the life you are living starts to narrow, quietly, gradually, into the shape of what you have always done. The narrowing is hard to see from the inside. It does not announce itself. It does not come with a moment of rupture or a clear before and after. It just slowly reduces the range of what feels possible. The responses that were once choices become reflexes. The reflexes become identity. And identity, once solidified, resists examination the way a wall resists being walked through. You stop asking because the asking stopped producing anything you recognized as useful. The grooves became comfortable. The comfort became home. And questioning home feels, for most people, less like growth and more like ingratitude. The world is particularly good at rewarding people who do not slow down. Workplaces value efficiency. They promote people who deliver results without requiring explanation, who handle situations with minimal friction, who have internalized the expectations so thoroughly that they no longer need to be managed. This is considered maturity. It is called professionalism. But there is a subtler reward underneath the obvious one. The person who never pauses also never makes anyone else uncomfortable. They do not raise questions that slow the room down. They do not introduce uncertainty into situations that the group has already agreed to treat as settled. In most environments, this is not just tolerated, it is actively preferred. The unexamined colleague is, in many ways, the easier colleague to work beside. Relationships settle into their own version of this. The longer two people know each other, the more the interactions can run on stored information. You think you know how this conversation will go. You think you know what the other person needs. The familiarity becomes shorthand, and the shorthand replaces the actual listening. This is considered comfort. It is called intimacy. And when someone inside a close relationship does begin to ask new questions about what they want, about what they have been carrying, about what they assumed was settled, it can feel threatening to the people around them. Not because the questions are harmful, but because the stability of the group had been built on everyone agreeing not to ask them. Change in one person requires adjustment in all the others. So even people who love you can, without knowing it, participate in keeping your patterns in place. Even our relationship with time rewards this tendency. There is always more to do than there is time to do it. Reflection is treated as a luxury, something you earn after the work is finished, and the work is never finished. The unexamined life is not just permitted. It is, in many contexts, actively encouraged. The person who pauses too long is perceived as indecisive. The person who questions their own assumptions is sometimes seen as unstable. The person who cannot immediately account for why they do what they do makes other people uneasy. So we learn to keep the machinery running. We learn to produce the expected outputs. We learn to perform continuity because continuity is what is trusted. And slowly, the performance becomes the person, not because we are dishonest, but because we never stepped back far enough to see the distance between the two. There is something worth naming here about the language we use for this. We call it being realistic. We call it maturity. We call it knowing who you are. These are not dishonest descriptions, but they also serve a particular function. They make the stopping of inquiry sound like wisdom. They frame the unexamined life as the earned reward of someone who has been through enough to stop questioning. This is the subtlest reinforcement of all, not the workplace, not the relationship, not the schedule, but the story we tell ourselves about why the examination is no longer necessary, why we have, at some point, graduated out of the need to ask. Socrates believed that most people are asleep while they are awake. Not literally, but in a way that matters more than the literal. They move through their days guided by inherited assumptions, absorbed opinions, and unexamined desires. They act, they respond, they pursue, but they do not look at the life they are building while they are building it. He was not being cruel when he said this. He was being precise. The examined life for Socrates was not about having the right answers. It was about the practice of inquiry itself, the willingness to turn the lens inward, to ask not just what you are doing, but why. Not just what you want, but whether you have ever actually decided to want it. He called this the most important thing a person could do. He also understood that almost no one wanted to do it. Because inquiry is uncomfortable in a way that productivity is not. Productivity gives you something to show for your time. Inquiry gives you questions. And questions, especially the ones that reach underneath your own self-image, are not comfortable to hold. They do not resolve quickly. They do not produce a clean result you can file away and move on from. They sit, they return, sometimes at 3 in the morning, sometimes in the middle of a familiar conversation when you catch yourself already knowing what you are going to say before the other person has finished speaking. There is another layer to this, something Socrates returned to again and again. He believed that most people confuse the appearance of virtue for virtue itself, confuse the appearance of a good life for a good life. We perform health, perform stability, perform contentment, and we are so convincing, including to ourselves, that we stop noticing the performance. This is not hypocrisy exactly, it is something quieter. It is the gradual substitution of the habit for the intention, the role for the person, the groove for the ground. He also understood something important about why this substitution happens so easily. Virtue, in his view, required ongoing attention. It was not a fixed property of character, but something that had to be actively maintained through reflection. You could not simply decide once at some earlier point in your life that you were a certain kind of person and then coast on that decision indefinitely. Life changes. Circumstances change. What served you at 30 may be limiting you at 45. What felt like strength may have quietly become rigidity. The examined life is the practice of noticing that substitution before it becomes permanent. When you hold his story next to this, something shifts. Not the facts of the story, not the events, the relationships, the patterns. Those remain the same. What shifts is the frame around them. He was not a bad partner. He was not emotionally unavailable in any dramatic sense. He was, in a meaningful way, doing his best with the tools he had inherited. The tools had worked. The tools were real. But the tools had also become the totality of his response. Every situation had been processed through the same mechanism, not because the mechanism was always appropriate, but because it had never been examined. It had never been held up and asked, "Does this still serve you? Does this actually serve the people you love?" The exhaustion he sometimes felt, that low, persistent sense that something was slightly off without being able to name it, that was not a symptom of weakness. It was information. It was the gap between the pattern and the person trying to speak. Think about what that gap actually costs. Not in the obvious way, not in the dramatic rupture or the visible failure, but in the quieter way. The conversation he was not quite present for. The moment someone close to him needed something other than a solution and did not receive it. The version of himself that might have shown up differently with more curiosity, more tolerance for not knowing, more willingness to simply stay inside the discomfort with another person, that version was there. It simply could not find a way through the habit. He had learned, somewhere and early, to trust consistency over curiosity, to trust the reliable response over the present one. And the world had rewarded him for it consistently enough that the reward itself had become evidence that the approach was correct. This is what circular thinking looks like when it runs quietly in the background of a life. The pattern produces results. The results confirm the pattern. The pattern continues. And somewhere in that loop, the actual question, what do I want my life to be? Who do I want to be inside it? Never gets asked. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to this. Not the loneliness of isolation, where no one is present, but the loneliness of being the only one who senses that the person showing up in every room is not quite complete. Not because something is missing in any dramatic way, but because the full version of you, the one with questions, with uncertainty, with the capacity to be surprised by yourself, has been quietly waiting for a moment that keeps not arriving. This is what unexamined life actually looks like. Not dramatic failure, not visible suffering, just the slow narrowing of possibility into habit, the slow disappearance of the question. The examined life does not promise better outcomes. It promises that you are actually there for the ones you have. This is a difficult thing to sit with, because it is not asking you to change anything. It is not pointing toward a solution. It is not suggesting that the patterns you carry are wrong or that the life you have built is less than it should be. It is simply asking whether you have looked at it, whether you have ever held your own behavior up to the light, not to condemn it, not to justify it, but just to see it clearly, to ask where it came from, to ask whether it still reflects something you would actually choose. This kind of looking requires a particular kind of honesty. Not the honesty of confession, where you admit to something you already know is wrong, but the honesty of inquiry, where you genuinely do not know what you will find and you stay with it anyway. That is harder than it sounds. Most of us are willing to look at ourselves in ways that confirm what we already believe. We are skilled at the kind of self-reflection that produces reassurance. We turn inward, we look around, we do not find anything obviously terrible, and we conclude that the examination has been completed. But the question is not whether you are a bad person. That question is almost never the useful one. The question is whether you know why you do what you do, whether the life you are living is one you have actually chosen, or one you have simply been following because it was familiar, because it was functional, because no one ever asked you to stop and reconsider. Most people will find when they begin to look that much of what feels like self is borrowed, that the opinions, the reflexes, the ways of relating were absorbed rather than selected. This is not a failure. It is what it means to be raised inside a culture, inside a family, inside time. But absorbed habits, once seen, become a choice. You can carry them forward consciously, having decided they still serve you, or you can begin to ask what you would carry instead. Either way, you are no longer simply running the program. You are the one deciding whether to run it. The discomfort of that question is not a sign that something is wrong with you. It is a sign that you are present enough to feel it. Most people live on autopilot not because they are careless, but because the autopilot was set long ago and no one told them they were allowed to reach for the controls. The examined life does not begin with answers. It begins with the decision to look. There is nothing dramatic required of you here. No resolution, no transformation, no clean arc toward clarity. Just the quiet practice of pausing occasionally before the automatic response fires, before the habitual interpretation takes hold, before the pattern completes itself without you. Just a moment of asking, is this me or is this what I have always done? Those are not always the same thing, and the gap between them, that small, uncomfortable space, is where something actual can begin. It does not have to be a large gap. It does not have to produce an immediate answer. The value is not in the answer. The value is in having asked, because the act of asking is itself a form of presence. It is the difference between a life that is happening to you and a life you are, however imperfectly, actually inside of. The question is enough to begin with. The unexamined life does not end in catastrophe. It ends in a kind of absence. The absence of the person who might have been there if only they had looked. The conversations that were completed without being heard. The years that passed through the familiar grooves, adding up to a shape that no one quite chose. You are looking now. That is already something different.